Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for everyone for joining us today. My presentation is covering reserve studies and specifically your 2024 priorities. My name is Sean Kargari from Association Reserves. I'm president of our Los Angeles office, as you guys know. I've been working in the reserve study industry for the past 21 years. If you have any general questions, even if you're not a client, please feel free to reach out at any time. But let's jump into the presentation today. So it is officially 2024. We all have New Year's resolutions that I hope we're all sticking with. If you have not completed the mandatory California decking inspections, I highly recommend that the first thing you do, the New Year's resolution for your community, is to get this on the schedule as soon as possible. We are less than 1 year away from the deadline, which is January 1st, 2025. We do fear that there may be a severe demand crunch if it's not already in place. That is going to result in a spike in inspection costs potentially. So you want to get this completed on time and not miss that deadline. And to view these inspections, if you're still on the fence about getting these inspections done, you have to know that it's California law. This is a state law that you have to get this completed, especially as board members. You don't want to miss the deadline and expose the board to some potential liabilities. But how do you seize this opportunity and maximize the value of the investment in these inspections? Well, if you have not completed the inspection yet, I do recommend that you complete the inspection as soon as possible and complete it before your next reserve study update for 2024. That way we can incorporate the inspection's findings into the reserve study and sharpen the assumptions from there. If you have any scheduled decking projects for this year, resealing, waterproofing, I do recommend that you do the inspections first. That way, if you spend, for example, tens of thousands of dollars to resurface your decks, you don't want to run into a situation where the inspection finds a major issue underneath in the structural elements that's going to require you to totally rebuild the deck altogether. So at this point, it's better to do the inspections first and not try to spruce up the decks because there could be some underlying issues that will require you to redo those projects. If this year is problematic with these inspections, if you do incur very long lead times, very high costs than anticipated, in the future, 7, 8 years from now, I would recommend jumping ahead of the line and get your next round of inspections completed ahead of schedule. This way you can avoid any potential extra cost and hardship, and then you can set up the community every 9 years moving forward to avoid that altogether. You're going to be a year or two ahead from that storm that's going to build up and hit every 9 years. It's going to be pretty predictable, but you can jump ahead of that. So that's some good planning to consider. Also, if destructive testing is in order, if they're going to remove the bottom of your balcony, which is called the soffit, if they're going to remove that stucco to access the structural elements, inquire about installing ventilation screens when they patch up your balconies. The ventilation screens will help with future maintenance by letting the decks release moisture, which should decrease future dry rot and fungus issues. And also the ventilation screens can be removed for the next round of inspections. And hopefully all they need to do is use borescopes instead of ripping out the stucco again in future years. This should decrease the cost of future inspections. So definitely inquire about that. And moving forward, definitely follow your reserve study waterproofing recommendations. Oftentimes, balcony decks are repaired on an as-needed basis, meaning the board perhaps reacts to complaints from owners, oh, we're getting water intrusion, or my deck is, soft and spongy. But moving forward, these inspections are going to discover a lot of systemic issues if system-wide waterproofing is not implemented. So it's going to be cheaper to be proactive, get all the decks on the same schedule, get them completed together, and hopefully the next round of inspections yield, an A+ rating. You guys are good, keep up the good work, and you don't have any structural repair costs from there. The reason you want to follow this method is the cost of inaction is very high. The balcony you see here was literally coming apart. It could fall any moment. This was a photo that I took from a community here in Los Angeles. The scary thing was it looked like this balcony deck was still in use. There was no caution tape or anything. I reported this to the manager immediately, but it's a no-brainer that this is a huge liability for the community. Safety is paramount. We cannot allow balcony decks to get in this state. It'll be it's basically unethical to have unsafe balcony decks, but aside from that, the costs become extreme. Here's an example of another Los Angeles client who had to spend $145,000 to rebuild 3 balcony decks. The waterproofing would have been about $3,000 per deck. So if you choose to ignore the maintenance responsibilities for these decking systems, they are very vulnerable to water intrusion, just like roofs. They require a lot of TLC, just like roofs. And oftentimes they're ignored altogether because the leaking most often is outside. But if you're seeing staining underneath your balcony decks, that's a big red flag. It should be the reaction to that should be the same as dealing with a roof leak, because the cost can really become outrageous. So it is cheaper to maintain the balcony decks on schedule rather than waiting for them to decay and having to deal with a reconstruction project instead. So we're into the new year. You got your reserve study most likely over the summer or last fall. I hope that you used it for your annual budget meeting and implemented the recommendations. But it doesn't mean that it's now expired. This is a tool that you should refer to throughout the year. Review the list of projects. The reserve study is not just for budget season. Go through those scheduled reserve projects and start prioritizing them. Schedule inspections from your service providers, obtain proposals, obtain opinions from your service providers, and provide updates to your reserve specialists. There are some situations where your service providers will give you an alternative. For example, we can extend the remaining useful life of the roof another 5 years if we implement this repair project instead of replacing at this time. Based on their professional opinion, and if the board follows through with that repair recommendation, we can then extend the remaining life of the roof on the reserve study. Another common extension possibility can come in the form of your elevator system. If your elevator company is confident that they have enough replacement parts and they can keep the system running as part of your service contract that you already have, longer than a normal useful life, if the elevator is already 25 or 30 years, but your elevator company is confident that they can extend the life another 5 years with just regular maintenance, based on their professional opinion, at that point, us and as a reserve study provider can feel good about extending the remaining life, but only based on those opinions. And so, it's a good opportunity to seek that information. And if you do not act on full replacement at this time, obtaining those proposals, cross-referencing that with the reserve study, make sure it lines up with the cost ranges. It's a good opportunity to sharpen the reserve study assumptions because this is a team effort. Us as reserve specialists, we rely on board members and property managers to provide us with updates. So even if you don't have an active update that's been started at this time, it's pretty early in the fiscal year, But if you want to share that information so we can file it away, so when we start working on your next reserve study update this summer or fall, feel free to reach out and share that with us. Again, we're part of your team. We're here to help, and we want to make sure that your reserve study is as sharp as possible. So as you go through your list of projects that are scheduled, how do you prioritize these, especially if reserve funds are really low? You don't have a lot of resources at the moment. Is there any room, any opportunity to defer projects? We view every reserve project as having certain failure modes. The 5 failure modes that we highlight are the first one here shown with the green light, the inconsequential. That can be your lobby furniture, your rec room kitchenette. It could be aged in appearance. It does have a aesthetic value, and that is important. But if you have roofs and elevators and balcony decks that are all overdue for completion, perhaps pushing this project back for now, a year or two, is a good idea. Beyond that, if you, like I said, if you can reach out to your service providers, and they say, oh, the system it's older, but it's not obsolete totally. We do have replacement parts. Perhaps, again, based on their opinion, we may be able to extend the remaining life on the reserve study. The reevaluation is important. This is why we have 3-year site inspections. If your carpet is 15 years old and it was assigned a 10-year life on the reserve study, but it's still in great shape, based on the current conditions, the visual conditions, we don't need anyone else's opinion as reserve specialists. That's an opportunity to extend certain useful lives based on the current visual conditions. It's just flat out aging better than expected. You're in luck. The projects that you do not want to defer most often boils down to protection and any sort of catastrophic results from not completing the project. So let me give you some protection examples. Like we discussed, decking, asphalt repair and reseal, that's a very common one. Metal and wood repainting projects, planter bed waterproofing, roof maintenance. If your roof is overdue for replacement, just replacing that roof. These are all projects that usually if you defer them, they're going to result in much higher repair and remediation costs. And also they're going to drastically shorten the life expectancy of the asset. So it's going to be flat out more expensive not to complete these projects on schedule than just letting them, decay and left to exposure. And while you're at it, it's really important to have building exteriors in first-class condition. So, as a reminder, in this situation, if you have wood siding that's peeling, it's unattractive. You're going to let water intrusion in. You're going to end up having to replace the wood siding in the near future if you don't do something about it. So, you have one alternative where it's ugly and more expensive, or it's going to be cheaper and beautiful. So, choose the cheaper path. It's going to be the easier route, and you won't have to deal with repair projects on a regular basis moving forward. And here's an example with the asphalt. This is asphalt that has never been touched. You need to reseal or slurry your asphalt every few years. In between that, you should be doing crack sealing. If you neglect to maintain your asphalt, you may cut the useful life in half. And meanwhile, this is what it looks like. The catastrophic examples, this boils down to, of course, safety. Hot water systems, elevators, fire alarm systems, air conditioning. If you have a cooling tower that the entire high rise relies on, that sort of situation. And any known structural issues. You can't put people's health and safety in jeopardy. For example, with elevator systems, if an elevator fails, and you're able to then, right away start the process, hire the company for that modernization project. Normal a normal turnaround time for an elevator modernization project is about 8 to 12 weeks under normal circumstances. During the supply crunch crisis in the past year or two, some of these projects took 6 months to complete because of, the necessary parts that had to be obtained. So if you have a situation where the elevator company recommended modernization a year or two ago, and that recommendation was ignored, and the elevator system was left to fail, you could end up in a situation where the community has no elevator for 6 months. Elderly people are taking the stairs, they're carrying their groceries up, and now you got a liability issue. And it's not just staying out of trouble. You don't want people to get hurt. So keep that in mind. You have to follow the business judgment rule, act in good faith, the best interests of everyone. Even if that old lady who would be forced to use the stairs was very vocal about keeping the dues low, keep in mind that you as the board have to follow different set of rules and follow this business judgment rule just to protect yourself. So now that the 2024 budget was already passed, you're starting your new fiscal year. You may come away from that last budget season a little disappointed. Perhaps you could not motivate the rest of the board to pass the proper amount of reserve contributions that the reserve study recommended, and you're a little lost. You feel stymied on how to get others around you, the community at large, to focus in on the reserve study recommendations and change course with the reserve funding, because it's going to create a lot of problems for you. It's going to make your job as a board member much more difficult in the future as you try to address these issues, these major concerns. So you'll get a lot of questions, do we have enough in reserves? If we have $500,000 in reserves, does that mean they're automatically strong? Is it based on a percentage of the annual budget? The answer boils down to deterioration value. The most common pushback that you'll get on reserves is, why should I fund for future expenses? It's almost like I'm doing a future owner a favor. Well, the answer is reserve contributions are not for future expenses. It's for a current ongoing expense, meaning that all of your reserve projects have different useful lives and costs. As each of those those assets age month to month, year to year, that has a dollar value, and your reserve contributions need to offset that dollar value. So, with the Olympic swimmers here chasing that pace bar, the pace bar is the cost of deterioration. Your reserve contributions need to keep up, and if you do so, it makes this process a lot easier for all owners, because any swimmer doesn't want to jump into a relay race being laps behind. It's going to be pretty demoralizing to catch up and a lot of extra effort. You as an owner, when you buy into a community association, you don't want to be handed an extra expense, meaning if the reserves are not funded and the costs are not spread out equally to the ownership over each project's useful life, it boils down to then simply punishing only the current unlucky set of owners who happen to be living at the community at the time of big projects coming due. So that's really not a fair and efficient way to fund reserves, because when you get hit with special assessments, you are responsible for your unit's share of that special assessment, whether you've lived there for 5 years or 5 weeks, and the prior owner who used the roof or the elevator for 20 years didn't pay any money into that asset. So fairness is very important. How do we calculate reserves? We calculate it based on, and the answer to how much reserves are enough will boil down to percent funded. So in this simple example, you have a pool project with a value of $10,000, a useful life of 10 years, a remaining useful life of 5 years. The question is, how much should you have at this point of time? All 10,000? None? The answer is $5,000, because you are at the halfway point of that useful life. Half of the project value should be saved up at this point. If this was your only reserve project that you had to deal with and you saved $5,000 at this point, you would be 100% funded, even though you still have to save the rest of the project value in the 5 years to come, it means, like those swimmers, you're keeping pace, and you are currently on the perfect pace to continue on. Year 5, the fully funded balance is $5,000. If you have that, you're 100% funded. Great. Next year, another 1,000. If you meet that, you're still 100% funded, and so on and so forth until you get to the project due date. And it is a valid project. It's definitely due for completion. You have the $10,000 saved. You pull the trigger and complete the project on schedule. And this is very important because a lot of communities take all the right steps. They collect the reserve funds. They follow their reserve study recommendations, and then suddenly they become very gun shy about spending reserves. There becomes sort of a pride associated with the reserve fund balance, which I could totally understand. It's kind of cool to say we have $1 million in reserves, we're in great shape. However, if those reserves were earmarked for those protection projects like decking and asphalt and wood repainting, and you are not spending the funds on schedule, you're not completing those projects on schedule, then you can open up a whole can of worms. So it's very important to spend the reserves on schedule when it's appropriate, when it's a valid project that needs to be completed. And what happens when you complete a project is that the fully funded value, the fully funded balance of that certain project resets. So in the example of the pool, every 10 years for $10,000, when it's due for completion, yeah, the fully funded balance is $10,000 because you need all the funds right now. It's due for completion. When you complete the project, it resets. In year 1, it resets to $1,000. So as you spend reserves, you will lower the deterioration value overall. The fully funded balance will decrease accordingly. And that's where you realize, and you can see it actually in reality with communities going ahead and spending $1 million on various projects, and going from 100% funded to 100.5% funded because they're percent funded. You're completing the projects on schedule, those life cycles reset, and you no longer need the full value on hand. And so there's a correlation between your reserve fund balance and your fully funded balance, and it will not affect your percent funded in those optimal schedules and implementation. So why is percent funded important? Think of it as like a credit score for any community association. The reason that we assume that reserves that are 0 to 30% funded are in a weak reserve position, shown here with the red bars, is that you will have a very high risk year to year of having to rely on special assessments to fill the funding voids. And so this is why being less than 30% funded is not ideal at all. It's going to lead to very long board meetings, a lot of tough choices and decisions, and a lot of times the hard reality is that projects are deferred. Additional damage happens to the common areas, and expenses go up from there. If you are 30 to 70% funded, you are in a fair reserve position where the risk of special assessment is much lower. And if you are 70% funded or higher, the risk of special assessment is drastically lower from there. That is why you do not have to have 100% funding in your reserves to be considered strong, in a strong position. You can be 70% funded or higher. So if you are down here, in 20%, 10, 20% range, you're not going to get to strong reserves overnight. Our goal in our funding plans is to build up your reserve fund strength gradually and to avoid the risk in a gradual manner. We're not going to hit the community over the head to increase their reserves to 100% overnight. The near-term priority will be having enough available funding, either from reserves or if a special assessment recommendation is needed, having enough funding just to complete the near-term projects and then gradually building up your reserve fund strength from there. One incentive here, you can see if you are 30% funded, Just by going from 30% to 40% funded, you've cut the risk of special assessment nearly in half. And if you can get to 50% funded, that's when things really become less burdensome. You can start to relax a little bit because the risk dramatically decreases from there. So keep that in mind. Long term, our goal is to reach full funding. We want to get you to 100% funded, but oftentimes that's after 30 years. In the meantime, we really are aiming for some stable thresholds, and we want to avoid baseline funding situations, which really on paper, people come up with baseline reserve funding plans, but it's not a practical, responsible reserve funding plan long term. So let's run through the scenarios because you on the board may be getting pushback by residents who say, well, why don't we just special assess when the time comes? Even though that's unfair, let's handle it that way, and we'll keep assessments low, and our property values will be maximized, and so forth. But let's do a scenario here regarding the funding of a $250,000 roof project, and we're going to lay out 3 options here, which are budgeted reserve contributions. Over the 15-year life of this roofing project, if the community dedicates themselves to the proper reserve contributions, they will actually decrease the cost of this project by almost $19,000 based on very low interest rate of 1% actually, which nowadays you can get much better than that. So I need to update the slide because you can knock down the price a lot more from here. That is because over the 15 years, your reserves have garnered that interest income, which stays in the reserve fund. And so it brings down the project cost. Well, what about that special assessment? Here we go. It's, right on the bullseye. This seems, perhaps practical, but oftentimes, well, I should say, I've never worked with a community who has no reserves, doesn't have a reserve budget, and will just refer to their scheduled projects and special assess year to year, and let alone special assess on schedule. Oftentimes, nothing is done with the common areas. Water intrusion is left to fester for years, if not decades. And so there's the hidden cost of deferred maintenance. You can have tens of thousands of dollars of extra repair costs out here, which, you can't really quantify at all. And these are all just Band-Aids, perhaps to extend the roof another few years. But when it gets so bad and the community passes that special assessment, all those Band-Aids, all the thousands of dollars that were put into the roof are just ripped off and removed with the new roof. So this really isn't an accurate presentation. There's a lot of extra costs associated with special assessments. And again, it's unfair. Only the current owners are getting hit with it, not instead of spreading the costs equally over time. There is the loan, which is our third option. But again, that comes with a different sort of interest, and it's not the interest that you want. Over this 7-year loan, which I believe is 6% interest, now the true cost of this roof project has increased to $320,000. So, the spread between the reserve contributions and the loan is almost $90,000. $90,000 more dollars for the exact same roof. You're not getting solar panels or something special on top of that. Now, loans are a great tool to use in emergency situations. But with respect and special assessments, I've had communities that obtain loans and special assessments to repay those loans, and they build themselves or they get themselves out of deep holes, and they commit to the proper reserve funding moving forward. But it should not be a long-term strategy. If you have no reserves, it could be very difficult to obtain that loan. Oftentimes, you have to keep a minimum balance with that bank, that institution. So some of your reserves are actually going to be kept in storage until you repay that loan. So these are all things to keep in mind. It's very dysfunctional to try to repeat multiple special assessments, major special assessments, and get multiple loans because it's probably not going to work out well. And if the savings here from the interest income, okay, $19,000 over 15 years, if that's not very tantalizing, remember there's a lot of other projects in play. So if you have a $250,000 roof, you probably have at least 100,000 $150,000 paint project. You may have $100,000 balcony project, elevator systems, you name it. So extrapolate the savings, and you're going to save enough funds to pay for a major project over the 30 years of reserve studies forecasts, just from the interest income alone. So try to steer board members and the membership at large to the bigger picture and how you will be saving them money just by increasing the reserve contribution, say another $20 or $30 per month this year. So hopefully this gives you more ammunition going into your next budget meeting. And finally, I mentioned that common argument about, hey, keep those assessments low and maximize property values. But you can certainly understand that allowing your common areas to decay will have an adverse effect on property values. We did a study of 200 clients in the San Fernando Valley and compared their reserve studies per percent funded levels to their listed home values per square foot on Zillow. And we found that clients that had strong reserves, 70% funded or higher, had over 12% higher property values listed. And that's not a surprise at all. If the common areas are in great shape, the building facade looks great, you're going to maximize your home's value when it comes time to sell. Even if it was only a 3% bump, that value would more than justify increasing the contributions. You would get a lot of your reserve contribution investment back when you go to sell. The sad situation is when you think of an owner who decides to sell because the repair costs are becoming out of control at any given community. Perhaps they bought into, it's a good idea to keep reserves low, reserve contributions low, because everyone's on fixed, or not everyone, but a lot of people are on fixed incomes. Times are tough. We had the pandemic, recessions, and so forth. Let's keep the contribution low and not impose this hardship on the membership. But then they get hit with these out of control special assessments, loan repayments, and they decide to bail out. You know what? I'm going to move to Arizona, Texas. The last parting shot is, losing out on the full potential of your property value. And last I looked, the average home price in, like, say, Sherman Oaks, Studio City is $800,000 a unit. That 12% boost adds up to almost $100,000 in value. So again, keep the big picture in mind. By increasing their reserve contributions, the goal is to save each owner a lot of money by avoiding unnecessary repair costs that are avoidable and maximizing property values. In addition to having strong reserves, again, maintaining your community in first-class condition, which is actually the cheapest option on the table. Having stable reserve budgets, usually, you can enjoy 3%, 4% annual increases per year. It makes passing that reserve budget very simple. No one usually raises a big fuss about, nominal annual increases. The owners see the results and the benefits of their investment into the reserve fund. When you have artificially low reserve contributions, a lot of big projects don't get done. And so therefore the membership may be very down about the reserve contribution altogether because, they're getting nothing for it. A lot of it may be diverted to those Band-Aid repairs instead. Which is, ultimately wasteful spending, because if the roof is overdue for completion, by then you should have completed that replacement project anyways. Again, promoting fairness, spreading the costs evenly over every project life cycle, extending project useful lives, like with asphalt, getting, another decade, if not more, out of that. maximizing property values, and reducing board liabilities. And here I just want to touch upon the annual reserve study cycle. The reserve study cycle, this is a year-round process. So, if you're not actively updating the reserve study right now, or if you're not actively working with your reserve specialist, keep good records, reach out to your vendors, try to get updated costs, proposals if they're willing to give that to you. Start the reserve study update process early because you want to have the draft in hand with plenty of time to send questions to your reserve specialists. Perhaps there's some revisions needed, or there's a surprise project that springs up right before your annual budget meeting. You want to go into your annual budget meeting with a thoroughly reviewed reserve study that you finalized, and that way it's the best tool you can bring to that meeting. We have a lot of clients reaching out in October, November, even around Thanksgiving, who are desperate to get a reserve study update because they waited too long. Just like it's kind of like that, waiting too long for those upcoming decking inspections. It can be very frantic. So, start that process early. The next step is passing your annual budget. We hope that you follow the reserve study recommendations. And the final step is to obtain the reserve disclosure from your reserve specialist. This is an additional document which needs to be included in your annual budget packet. And from there, rinse, repeat, you'll start the cycle over again. If you are currently in the market for a reserve study update, you're not sure what level of service to go with, there's 3 primary levels of service. Level 1 is a full on-site reserve study. This is usually required only once. If you have a thorough full reserve study, that lays the foundation for all future updates. We can take those quantities and the list of projects and use that to update the reserve study in future years from there. A with site visit update is required every few years. In California specifically, it's required every 3 years. Some states, it's every 5 years. Again, you can start with the full. 3 years from now, we can use that template to update your reserve study with a with site visit, meaning that we're going to come to the property, but we don't have to remeasure and recount everything. However, if you do have a project or a capital improvement that has resulted in modifications, let your reserve specialist know. If it's something minor, we replaced one floor, one level of carpeting, but not the rest. They're going to have different life cycles moving forward. I can tell you, we'll remeasure that level free of charge. We don't have to charge for a full reserve study just because one level just needs to be remeasured at this time. I've had clients inform me that they need a full reserve study because they replaced the pool furniture and the counts are different. That's not necessary. I'll gladly recount your pool furniture. The only time I would recommend, resetting with a fresh, full reserve study, even though you've had prior professional reserve studies in the past, is if you're not happy with your prior reserve study, or just out of curiosity, you just want to verify that everything was in order. That's a good idea if you're switching companies to maybe start with a full reserve study. And of course, if you're in a newer community and it's being built in phases, we're going to have to do full inspections of those new phases. An NSV, a no site visit update, can be obtained in between the 3-year site inspections. And it's a really good value because you can stay on top of your reserve funds. For example, if you are due for a site inspection in 2024, think of all the inflation that occurred between your last reserve study site inspection in 2021. By getting those no site visit updates, you could have stayed on top of the inflation, made the adjustments to your reserve funding last year and the year before. And that way you're not getting a big surprise 3 years later that, gosh, costs have gone up so much dramatically. And that's a situation that's totally out of everyone's control. So keep that in mind. Additional resources can be found at reservestudy.com. We have webinar recordings, articles, great ebooks. This is all stuff that if you want to do a deep dive into reserve studies, if you are new on the board, if you want to spread these resources to the rest of the board, or the rest of the community, this is a very valuable resource to you. We do have monthly webinars, new presentations that you can sign up for free of charge. So just putting that out there, this can only help rally support, make your job easier as a board member if the community has a better understanding of on why funding your reserves is so critical to the overall health of your community. And from there, I'd like to thank you all again for joining us today. My portion of the presentation is over, so I leave you in good hands, and thank you very much.